What happens when a beloved politician sits down for what should be a friendly late-night interview, only to discover the host has a completely different agenda? In just 36 seconds, Stephen Colbert would make a comment so shocking, so completely out of line, that it would turn a simple conversation about healthcare into the most explosive television moment of the year. But before we dive into this incredible confrontation, make sure you subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments what you think really happened that night. The Late Show studio was buzzing with its usual energy. The audience had just finished their warm-up, cameras were rolling, and Stephen Colbert was feeling particularly confident. He had interviewed hundreds of politicians over the years, and tonight was supposed to be just another routine chat with Senator Bernie Sanders about his latest healthcare proposals. Bernie walked onto the stage with that familiar smile, waving to the cheering crowd. He looked relaxed, maybe even a little excited to share his message with millions of viewers. The handshake between the two men seemed genuine enough, but something was already brewing beneath the surface. "Senator Sanders, welcome back to the show," Colbert said, settling into his chair with that trademark smirk. "Always a pleasure to have you here." "Thanks for having me, Stephen. Great to be back," Bernie replied, adjusting his suit jacket and leaning forward slightly. The first few minutes went exactly as expected. They talked about Bernie's recent trip to Vermont, made some light jokes about the weather, and the audience was eating it up. But then Colbert shifted gears in a way that caught everyone off guard. "So Bernie, let me ask you something," Colbert said, his tone suddenly changing. "You've been pushing this Medicare for All thing for years now. Don't you think it's time to maybe, grow up a little bit?" Bernie's eyebrows shot up. The audience went quiet. This wasn't the usual playful banter they were used to seeing. "I'm sorry, grow up?" Bernie asked, clearly confused by the sudden shift. "Well, yeah," Colbert continued, leaning back in his chair like he owned the place. "I mean, you're talking about completely overhauling our entire healthcare system. It's kind of like a kid wanting to redesign his whole house because he doesn't like the color of his bedroom walls." The audience was starting to murmur. This wasn't going the way anyone expected. Bernie took a deep breath, clearly trying to stay composed. "Stephen, I think you're misunderstanding what Medicare for All actually means. We're talking about saving lives here. People are dying because they can't afford their medication." "Oh, come on," Colbert interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. "People have been saying that for decades. If it was really that big of a problem, don't you think someone would have fixed it by now?" You could feel the tension in the room getting thicker. Bernie's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "Actually, Stephen, people have been trying to fix it. That's exactly what I've been doing for the past 30 years. The problem is that insurance companies and pharmaceutical corporations have too much power in Washington." Colbert laughed, but it wasn't a friendly laugh. It was the kind of laugh you make when you think someone just said something ridiculous. "So let me get this straight," Colbert said, pointing at Bernie like he was lecturing a child. "You think there's some big conspiracy by insurance companies? That sounds a little paranoid, don't you think?" The audience was getting uncomfortable now. You could hear people shifting in their seats, clearing their throats, wondering what was happening to their usually entertaining show. Bernie's face was starting to redden, but he was still trying to keep things civil. "It's not paranoid when you can look at the numbers, Stephen. Americans pay twice as much for healthcare as people in other developed countries, and we get worse outcomes." "Numbers, numbers, numbers," Colbert said, rolling his eyes dramatically. "You sound like an accountant, not a politician. Where's the inspiration? Where's the hope? All you do is complain about problems." That comment hit Bernie like a slap across the face. His whole political career had been built on fighting for working families, on giving people hope for a better future. To have someone dismiss that as just complaining was insulting on a level that few people could understand. "Stephen, I've spent my entire life fighting for working families," Bernie said, his voice getting stronger. "I've been arrested protesting for civil rights. I've stood on the Senate floor for hours defending Social Security. That's not complaining, that's fighting." Colbert shrugged like Bernie had just told him about his grocery shopping list. "Fighting, complaining, whatever you want to call it. The point is, you're 78 years old. Maybe it's time to let younger people take over?" The audience gasped. Even by late-night television standards, that was a low blow. Age had always been a sensitive topic in politics, and here was Colbert using it like a weapon. Bernie's eyes flashed with anger for the first time since he sat down. "You know what, Stephen? I may be 78, but at least I'm fighting for something bigger than myself." "What are you fighting for? Better ratings?" The studio fell completely silent. This was uncharted territory now. Colbert's face darkened. He wasn't used to guests pushing back like this. especially not in front of his own audience. "Excuse me?" Colbert said, his voice getting sharper. "I think you're forgetting whose show you're on." "No, I know exactly whose show I'm on," Bernie shot back. "I'm on the show of someone who apparently thinks healthcare is a joke and that fighting for working families is just complaining." The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Camera operators were looking at each other, wondering if they should keep rolling. The audience didn't know whether to clap, boo, or just sit there in stunned silence. Colbert's face was turning red now. He was used to being the one in control, the one asking the tough questions while guests squirmed in their chairs. But Bernie wasn't squirming. He was staring right back at him with the kind of intensity that comes from decades of fighting powerful people who thought they were untouchable. "You want to know what I'm fighting for?" Colbert said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I'm fighting to entertain people, to give them a break from all the doom and gloom politicians like you keep shoving down their throats." Bernie leaned forward in his chair, his hands clasped together. "So entertainment is more important than people's lives? That's your position?" "Don't twist my words," Colbert snapped. "I never said that." "You just said it," Bernie replied calmly. "You said you're fighting to entertain people, and that my work fighting for healthcare is shoving doom and gloom down people's throats." The audience was completely captivated now. This wasn't the usual scripted back and forth they were used to seeing. This was real, raw emotion playing out in real time. Colbert tried to regain his composure, but you could see the cracks forming. "Look, Bernie, I respect what you're trying to do, but let's be realistic here. You've been in Congress for 30 years, and what do you have to show for it?" That question hung in the air like a challenge. Bernie's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, you could see the fire that had driven him through decades of political battles. "What do I have to show for it?" Bernie repeated slowly. "I'll tell you what I have to show for it. The Veterans Affairs reform that helped millions of our veterans get better health care. The $15 minimum wage that's now law in multiple states. The millions of young people who are politically engaged because they believe we can build a better future." "But you never became president?" Colbert shot back with a cruel smile. "Twice you ran, twice you lost. Maybe the American people just don't want what you're selling." The low blow landed exactly as Colbert intended. Everyone in the studio knew how hard Bernie had fought in those primary campaigns, how close he had come, and how devastating those losses had been. But instead of crumbling, Bernie sat up straighter. "You know what, Stephen? You're right. I didn't become president. But I'll tell you what I did become. I became someone who inspired millions of people to believe that change is possible. I became someone who made Medicare for all and the Green New Deal part of the national conversation. I became someone who proved that you can run for president without taking money from billionaires and corporations." The audience started to murmur appreciatively. Bernie's passion was infectious, and even in this hostile environment, people were responding to his message. Colbert could sense he was losing the room. His usual tactics weren't working, and Bernie was turning the tables on him. "That's all very inspiring," Colbert said, his voice getting more aggressive. "But inspiration doesn't pay people's bills. Inspiration doesn't put food on the table." Bernie's voice rose for the first time since the confrontation began. "You think I don't know about bills? You think I don't know about putting food on the table? I grew up in a 3.5-room apartment in Brooklyn with my parents and my brother. My father sold paint for a living. We didn't have money for extras. We didn't have money for vacations. We barely had money for necessities." The personal revelation caught Colbert off guard. He hadn't expected Bernie to get this personal, this vulnerable. "So, when I talk about people struggling to pay for their medication, I'm not talking about statistics," Bernie continued, his voice getting stronger with each word. "I'm talking about my neighbors. I'm talking about people I grew up with. I'm talking about families who have to choose between paying rent and buying insulin." Colbert tried to interrupt, but Bernie wasn't finished. "And when some late-night talk show host sitting in his comfortable studio making millions of dollars a year tells me that fighting for those families is just complaining, yeah, I take that personally." The studio was dead silent. Even the camera operators had stopped moving. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was something much more powerful. Colbert's face was flushed now, and you could see him struggling to figure out how to respond. He had pushed Bernie too far, and now he was facing the consequences. "I never said I was against helping people," Colbert said weakly, trying to backtrack. "No, you just mocked the idea that we should help them," Bernie replied. "You called it complaining. You called it doom and gloom. You suggested I should just give up and let younger people take over." "I was just trying to have a conversation," Colbert protested. Bernie shook his head. "No, Stephen, you weren't trying to have a conversation. You were trying to score points. You were trying to make me look foolish so your audience would laugh and you'd get better ratings." The accusation hit home. Everyone could see it on Colbert's face. He had been caught, and there was no way to deny it. But here's the thing, Bernie continued, his voice getting calmer but somehow more intense. I don't care about your ratings. I don't care about looking foolish. I care about the woman in Vermont who rationed her insulin and died because she couldn't afford a full dose. I care about the man in Ohio who had a heart attack but didn't call an ambulance because he was afraid of the bill. Colbert was squirming now, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. Those are the people I'm fighting for, Bernie said, looking directly into the camera instead of at Colbert. Not for entertainment, not for ratings. For them. The camera lingered on Bernie's face as he spoke directly to the viewers at home. For a moment, it felt like Colbert wasn't even there anymore. This had become something bigger than a late-night interview. It had become a moment of truth. But Colbert wasn't about to let Bernie have the last word on his own show. His ego was bruised, and wounded egos can be dangerous things. You know what, Bernie? Colbert said, his voice taking on a nastier edge than anyone had heard before. Maybe the problem isn't the system. Maybe the problem is that you're just not very good at your job. The audience gasped. Even by the standards of this already heated exchange, that comment was shocking in its cruelty. Bernie turned to look at Colbert, his expression a mixture of disbelief and disappointment. Excuse me? I mean, think about it, Colbert continued, apparently deciding to go all in on his attack. 30 years in Congress, and you still can't get your big ideas passed. Maybe that says more about your abilities than it does about the system. The silence in the studio was deafening. This had crossed a line that nobody expected a professional broadcaster to cross. Bernie sat back in his chair, studying Colbert's face like he was trying to understand how someone could be so callous. Stephen, I honestly don't know what happened to you tonight, Bernie said quietly, but this isn't the person I thought I was coming to talk to. Oh, please, Colbert said, rolling his eyes again. Don't give me the disappointed grandfather routine. You came on this show to promote your agenda, just like every other politician. No, Bernie said, shaking his head slowly. I came on this show because I thought we were going to have a real conversation about issues that matter to working families. I thought I was talking to someone who cared about more than just getting laughs. Colbert's mask was completely off now. Well, maybe that was your mistake. This is television, Bernie. It's about entertainment. It's about ratings. It's about giving people what they want to see. And what do people want to see? Bernie asked. A host attacking his guests? A comedian punching down at someone who's trying to help people? They want to see reality, Colbert shot back. Not some fantasy about how we're going to magically fix everything with Medicare for all and free college. Bernie stood up from his chair. The audience held its breath. In all the years of late-night television, nobody could remember seeing anything like this. You want to talk about reality? Bernie said, his voice carrying across the silent studio. The reality is that people are suffering while folks like you sit in your comfortable studios making jokes about their pain. Colbert jumped to his feet as well, clearly losing all professional composure. Folks like me? What's that supposed to mean? It means people who have forgotten where they came from, Bernie replied. People who got successful and decided that anyone still struggling just isn't trying hard enough. I worked hard to get where I am, Colbert said defensively. I'm sure you did, Bernie nodded. But somewhere along the way you stopped caring about the people who are still working hard and getting nowhere. Colbert's face was bright red now. You don't know anything about me or what I care about. You're right, Bernie said, adjusting his jacket. I clearly don't, because the person I thought I was talking to tonight would never mock someone for fighting to make healthcare affordable. The person I thought I was talking to would understand that when people are dying because they can't afford insulin, that's not a punchline. The tension had reached a breaking point. Everyone in the studio could feel it. Maybe you should leave, Colbert said, his voice shaking with anger. Bernie looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You know what? Maybe I should. He turned toward the audience, many of whom were now openly showing their support for him with scattered applause. I want to say something to everyone watching at home, Bernie said, speaking directly to the cameras again. Don't let anyone tell you that caring about people is naive. Don't let anyone convince you that fighting for justice is a waste of time. And don't let anyone make you feel foolish for believing that we can build a better world. Colbert was standing there speechless, clearly realizing that this moment was going to define how people remembered this interview. The struggle continues, Bernie said, using his familiar closing phrase. Then he walked toward the exit, leaving Colbert alone on his own stage. The audience erupted in applause as Bernie made his way off the set. Some people were standing, Others were cheering, and a few were even shouting words of encouragement. Colbert stood there for several seconds, apparently trying to figure out what to do next. His show had just fallen apart in spectacular fashion, and there was no way to put it back together. "Well," he finally said, his voice much quieter now, "I guess we'll be right back after this commercial break." But as the cameras stopped rolling and the audience continued to buzz with excitement, everyone knew that nothing would be quite the same after tonight. In 36 seconds of cruel comments, Stephen Colbert had revealed something ugly about himself. And in his dignified response, Bernie Sanders had shown exactly why millions of people believed in his message. The confrontation was over, but the impact would be felt for much longer. Sometimes the most powerful moments in television happen when everything goes wrong and people show you who they really are.